Resourceful Designer, Episode 1, Introduction.
Welcome to the Resourceful Designer podcast, offering solutions to streamline your graphic and web design business so you can get back to designing. And now, your host. He loves being a designer so much that he wants to podcast about it. Mark Des Cotes.
Welcome, and thank you for tuning in to this very first episode of Resourceful Designer. As mentioned in the introduction, my name is Mark Des Cotes, your host, and I'm thrilled that you have decided to join me and streamline your design business so that you can get back to what it is you do best, and that's designing. Now, I think it's absolutely awesome that you're tuning in to listen to me, and the fact that you're here tells me a couple of things about you. One, you're either a graphic or web designer, perhaps both. And two, you're passionate about your profession. Passionate enough that you've sought out resources such as this podcast in order to better yourself. And I commend you on that. So you've found this podcast, you've pressed play, and now what? I'm sure you're wondering what this show is all about and why you should be listening to me. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm both a graphic designer as well as a web designer. I live in a rural community just outside of the city of Cornwall, Ontario, in Canada. And to give you some perspective, I'm roughly an hour's drive west of Montreal, Quebec, and just under an hour's drive southeast of Ottawa, Ontario, Canada's capital. I've lived in this area almost all my life, except for a short stint when I was very young and my parents moved to Pierrefonds, Quebec, before moving back to Cornwall. I attended the graphic design program right here in Cornwall at St. Lawrence College, a program that actually ended a couple of years after I graduated. Or I shouldn't say ended. St. Lawrence College has a few campuses, and they actually moved the program from Cornwall to one of their other campuses. But I was lucky enough to take the program in my hometown and stuck around this area after graduation. Now, when I took my course at St. Lawrence College, one of my professors would often say that it's really hard to get business once you graduate, or really hard to get work once you graduate, because so many people are looking for employees with experience. So he always told us that we should always put on our resume, because it was a 3-year program we had taken, we should put down that we had 3 years of experience. Because according to him, we weren't graphic designers after we graduated the program. We were graphic designers the minute we started the program, and we started learning, we started experiencing, experimenting, learning the trade, learning the tools, the history, the purpose, everything there is about design. Says all of that goes into your experience. So if I take what he said to heart, that means that I've now been doing this for over 25 years, because I graduated in 1992. Now back then there wasn't much call for web design, so it wasn't till quite a few years later that I actually got into web design. Now upon graduation from college, I was lucky enough to land a job at a local commercial printer in their design studio. I was hired on as a junior designer, where I was one of 5 designers on staff. Now, I stayed there for 15 years, working my way up the ranks until I was the equivalent of an art director. I was never actually given the title because nobody there had the title of art director, but in essence, that's the job I was doing. Now, during my time at that commercial printer, I started dabbling in web design, mostly because I wanted to build a website for the company I was working for. So I started dabbling with a few things, and my very first website that I did was designed in a program called Adobe PageMill. Some of you old timers out there might remember that WYSIWYG program. It was great for the time, and I must say I created some pretty interesting websites with it. And after creating the one for the printer I worked for, we started offering the service to our clients that would come in. And it started picking up. I was starting to do more and more websites for the clients. But if any of you have ever worked for a commercial printer, you know that there's a general mentality amongst management that says if the presses are not running, they're not making money. And whenever times started getting a little bit slow, management would kind of resent me working on websites for clients. Even though they were making the same amount of money from the clients, they were charging them the same fee, whether I was working on a flyer, a poster, or something else, as they were charging for me to work on a website. But since websites didn't keep the presses running, they would get annoyed whenever I was working on that and not something to push to the press room. So after a few years, they decided to eliminate website design from their program. Now, of course, we still had clients coming in and asking for stuff. There was a few clients I'd already done websites for, and it was also a natural progression. We had a lot of clients coming in that were startups, and they needed all their stationery and everything printed for their new business. And when they'd asked about websites, it was just natural for us to do it. So when the printing company decided we weren't doing websites anymore, I decided to take these clients on and do them at home. So I started freelancing web design at home while I was still doing graphic design at the print shop. Now in 2005, I decided to make it official and I created an actual web design company, still working part-time in the evenings. But then I started running into a problem. Some of my web design clients were also asking me if I could design other stuff for them. And I told them I could, but only if they came to the print shop because it was a conflict of interest for me to design stationery or logos or anything else other than a website when that was my day job for the printing company. But the problem was some of my new clients didn't want to deal with that printing company. They already had relationships with some other printing companies, or for one reason or the other, they just didn't want to deal with that company. And they were still asking me to do stuff. And I didn't want to do it because of the conflict of interest. And I was getting enough demand for this that one day I sat down with my wife and I told her, I says, I think I can make a go of this full time. So we had some money saved up. So I decided almost a year to the day after I had registered my web design company, I left the printing company and expanded my web design business to be a full graphic design business. And I haven't looked back since. So I'm approaching my 10-year mark in February where I've been working for myself from home in my home studio. And I haven't regretted a single day of it since. So that's the general idea of how I became a graphic designer and how I ended up working from home for myself. Some other stuff you might be interested in knowing. I'm married. I have a couple of kids. I have a son who's away at university and a daughter who is in her second last year of high school. I share the house with a couple of dogs. We have Shelties, and it's possible that during a podcast, you might hear them pipe up in the background. They're being nice and quiet right now, but they are Shelties, and Shelties tend to bark. So who knows? Maybe one day you might hear them. I also share the house with a cat, but she's closer with my wife and tends to ignore me most of the time. Now, this isn't my first foray into podcasting. I actually have a podcast network at solotalkmedia.com where I've been podcasting for the past couple of years on TV shows. I do TV fan podcasts, and I have a podcast for the now show Under the Dome that just finished on CBS. I do a podcast for the TV show Orphan Black, and I just finished one for the first season of Killjoys that airs on Sci-Fi in the US and Space here in Canada. And later this fall, I'll be starting a new TV fan podcast for The Expanse, also on Space and Sci-Fi. So that's how I got into podcasting. I also do a weekly podcast. Every Wednesday, there's an episode that comes out from Golden Spiral Media's Stuff I Learned Yesterday podcast. And that's a short, roughly 10-minute long podcast that just shares stories from my life or funny anecdotes or whatever, and the lessons that I've learned from them. So if you're interested in that, you can check that out. Just go to stuffilearnedyesterday.com and it'll redirect you to the page. So I'm not new to the podcasting world, but I decided after some time that even though I love podcasting about TV shows, my passion is design. I do design during the day. I've been doing this, as I said, for over 25 years. And I believe that I have a lot of stuff to share. And that's why I formed Resourceful Designer. It's both this podcast as well as a blog and resources for graphic and web designers who run their own studios. So what should you expect out of Resourceful Designer? Well, as I'd mentioned, this podcast and the blog is geared to helping designers streamline their business. That's my catchphrase, helping you streamline your business so that you can get back to what you do best, designing. I mean, that's our passion. That's what we do. We love designing stuff. The behind the scenes, invoicing, trying to figure out software, dealing with clients, registering domain names and all that stuff. It's all necessary. It's part of the business, but it takes us away from the actual designing. So that's my goal here, is to try to help you with all that behind the scenes stuff, because there's so many great resources. First of all, this is an audio podcast, so I'm not going to help you with design tips. I could tell you about different ways to design stuff and all that, but design is a visual medium, and my telling you how to do all this stuff would not help. So I've decided that I'm not going to be doing design tips or talking about design trends, but what I'm going to be talking about is the tools that we use, the resources that are available to us, as well as talking to people in the industry and getting insight on different things about the market and dealing with suppliers, clients, and all sorts of stuff like that. So who is this podcast and the blog for? I'm geared to helping designers who are kind of like me, who are running a studio out of their house. Or maybe you're running a studio by yourself, you're renting some space somewhere, but it's mostly the solo designers. or designers that have a very small team. Now, does that mean that if you don't have your own business, if you're working for someone else, you won't get any benefit? Of course not. I'm going to talk about a lot of things that you can use to help your company or to improve your skills and all that stuff. But I just want you to know that I'm focusing on the solo designers first and foremost. And that goes for both the podcast and the blog. Now, you're probably wondering about the schedule. I'm initially releasing this podcast with 4 episodes right off the bat. And then I'm going to follow with another episode a week after, another the week after that. And then from that point, I'm going to go to a bi-weekly schedule. So there'll be a new podcast episode every 2 weeks. And my goal is to put a blog post in between those. So 1 week I'll put a podcast out, 1 week I'll put a blog post out, and so forth and so forth. And I'll see how that goes. Now, in the future, I'm not saying that I won't change things and go to a weekly format. I would actually love that. But that'll all depend on the reaction I get from you. Now, I have a list of topics that I'm going to be covering in future episodes, such as attracting new clients, figuring out what your client needs as opposed to what they ask for, smart ways to work from home when you have kids running around, what to do when you mess up on a job, and all sorts of stuff. But because I'm doing this podcast in order to help you and your business, I would really love to hear what struggles you're facing. What are the challenges in your business that you wish you had help with? Reach out to me and I'll see if I can come up with a podcast episode or blog post to help you out. You can contact me at feedback@resourcefuldesigner.com. And I would love to hear what sort of problems you have in your graphic design or web design business that you would like help with. Now, if you've discovered this podcast through iTunes or through a Google search or something, and have just started listening, I encourage you to go over to resourcefuldesigner.com and check out the few blog posts that are already there. There's also a page with resources that you might find interesting for your business. And that's a page that I will keep expanding as more resources are discovered. Now, if you're listening to this episode on the website, I encourage you to subscribe on iTunes, and you can do that easily. Just click on the link on the website or go to resourcefuldesigner.com/iTunes, which will take you directly to the iTunes page where you can click the subscribe button. Now, while you're on resourcefuldesigner.com, be sure to check out my 4-week marketing boost. It's a small ebook I put together with 20 quick and simple tips that'll help improve your image in order to create the best possible first impression for clients who are visiting your website or your business. Now, most of these tips are things that you should already know, but sometimes you need a good kick in the pants and a reminder that they need to be done. And that's why I put the guide together. So click on the link on resourcefuldesigner.com to get my free guide, the 4-week marketing boost. So this was the purpose of this first episode. I just wanted to give you a brief introduction of who I am, who the host of Resourceful Designer will be, give you an idea of what the podcast and the blog and the website is all about, who it's for, and hopefully this is something that you'll find useful and interesting and come back for and possibly share with some other designers you know. And who knows, if you have an interesting story, maybe I'll have you on the podcast for an interview. But that's it for now. In the next episode, I plan on talking about some simple but often overlooked tricks to get you more work from your existing clients. So once again, thank you for tuning in. I really appreciate it. I think it's awesome that you found this podcast and that you're listening. And I really hope you join me for the long haul as we discover ways to streamline your graphic design or web design business so that you can get back to what you do best, designing. Until next time, I'm Mark Des Cotes, and I'm reminding you to stay creative.
Thanks for listening to the Resourceful Designer podcast at resourcefuldesigner.com.